In April this year, China's foreign minister visited Myanmar and did what no other great power would: back the military junta with reconstruction money and diplomatic cover. I'm David, and this story starts with one question: what does China win when everyone else walks away? In April 2026, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi arrived in Yangon with a message and a checkbook. He announced a package of reconstruction deals, infrastructure investment, and economic cooperation moves that served a single purpose: cementing Beijing as Myanmar's primary international backer at the exact moment when no other major power would touch the country. The junta's military coup in 2021 had triggered Western sanctions. By 2026, the US, EU, and most of the West had frozen Myanmar out. Diplomatic isolation was complete. But Wang Yi's visit said something clearer than any press release. China saw opportunity where the West saw only risk. What Beijing offered was exactly what the junta needed most: legitimacy on the world stage, fresh capital for reconstruction, and a great power willing to shield Myanmar from further international pressure. The timing was strategic. The junta had just held elections in 2025-26 that most of the world refused to recognize. Instead of facing that isolation alone, Myanmar's military government would face it with China's backing. That changed everything. This wasn't charity. Beijing's support came with expectations. Myanmar would deepen its economic ties to China, would rely on Chinese capital and Chinese expertise for its recovery, and would naturally align with Beijing's regional interests. From China's perspective, a weak and desperate junta was far preferable to any alternative regime that might turn to the West. But China's offer wasn't made in a vacuum. It filled a void that Western sanctions and ASEAN's own fractures had carved wide open. What made Beijing's timing perfect was the breakdown inside ASEAN itself. For years, ASEAN had tried to enforce a unified response to the junta through its so-called five-point consensus, a diplomatic framework meant to pressure Myanmar toward elections and democracy. It failed. By 2026, the bloc had splintered into two camps. On one side, pragmatists like Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos. These countries bordered Myanmar or had deep trade ties. They sent observers to the 2025-26 elections as a tacit form of recognition, prioritizing refugee management, border security, and access to Myanmar's natural resources over any principled stance on governance. For them, isolation wasn't an option. On the other, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Timor-Leste, which refused to recognize the elections and pushed for harder pressure on the junta. This split was China's opening. The pragmatist refusal to maintain unified sanctions meant Myanmar could still trade, still access capital, still function diplomatically, but only through Beijing. Western isolation had closed one door. ASEAN's internal breakdown had made every other door lead through China. The junta, facing military pressure at home and rejection abroad, had no other choice but to deepen its dependence on Beijing. That dependence would only grow. The real prize wasn't humanitarian. It was economic and strategic. Watch the map. China and Myanmar signed the economic corridor, with pipelines running from offshore Indian Ocean fields straight to China. This overland route bypasses the Malacca Strait, a maritime chokepoint carrying 1/3 of global trade. For Beijing, energy security. For the junta, strategic leverage. But here's the mechanism that makes this arrangement work. The junta's survival depends on hydrocarbon revenues. Myanmar's government controls the lowlands, Yangon, Naypyidaw, the coastal zones where offshore gas fields lie. These regions generate export revenue through oil and gas sales that keep the military apparatus funded. Soldiers need salaries. Weapons systems need maintenance. Without that revenue stream, the junta collapses. The armed resistance groups control the highlands and have grown strong enough to challenge the military across much of the country. But they cannot seize the coast or the urban centers where the cash flows. The military cannot dislodge the resistance from the uplands. The result is territorial stalemate. The junta holds roughly 1/3 of Myanmar's land area, including all the economically productive zones. China's reconstruction investments and infrastructure deals don't just provide goodwill, they directly strengthen the junta's revenue base. New ports, new pipelines, new investment channels, all of these let Myanmar monetize its hydrocarbon assets more effectively. Beijing becomes not just Myanmar's backer, but the junta's lifeline. There's a cost. The deeper the junta sinks into dependence on Chinese capital and Chinese markets, the less room it has to negotiate. Every reconstruction deal signed is a subtle loss of autonomy. The military government is trading long-term independence for short-term survival. While China locks in Myanmar, India faces a two-front crisis on its doorstep. Northeast India borders Myanmar, and that border is a war zone. Armed insurgency groups, some backed by factions inside Myanmar, some operating independently, stage attacks across the frontier. The Indian military has to patrol these borders, manage refugee flows, and contain violence that regularly spills into Indian territory. It's a constant bleed of resources and attention. But India's real problem is what's happening on the other side of Myanmar. China's investment in the CMAC, its deepening ties to the junta, its strategic positioning in Myanmar's ports and energy infrastructure. All of this shifts the balance of power in the Indian Ocean, India's traditional sphere of influence. Beijing is building leverage in a region where New Delhi has long been the dominant power. India can't outbid China. India can't match Beijing's willingness to work with an isolated regime. So, New Delhi is caught. It needs to manage the border insurgency, which requires some level of stability and cooperation with Myanmar. But the very Chinese investments that stabilize the junta also encroach on Indian strategic interests. There's no clean countermove available. India is being slowly squeezed out of a region it once controlled, while its own border bleeds. This military stalemate won't hold forever, and analysts project the outcome hinges on one question: how long can the junta fund its army? Researchers studying Myanmar's conflict assess that the junta will likely control roughly 1/3 of Myanmar's territory through 2031. But this isn't dominance, it's attrition. The military faces mounting casualties, desertion rates are rising, and morale is eroding. The armed resistance groups are fragmented. They can't seize the major cities, but they're strong enough to make control costly and uncertain. This equilibrium depends on hydrocarbon revenues staying stable and the military's cohesion holding. Both are at risk. First, Myanmar's hydrocarbon exports have already declined. Attacks on infrastructure, pipeline disruptions, and the cost of defending energy assets during wartime have all cut into the revenue the junta was counting on. If this trend continues, the regime loses its capacity to pay soldiers within 5 years. Second, military dissent is creeping. Coup rumors circulate regularly. While analysts rate an outright coup attempt as very low risk, the mere fact that it's being discussed suggests structural strain. Extended warfare, Chinese dependence, and years of stalemate wear on officer corps. The research indicates China's role is conditional, not unconditional. Beijing wants to prevent either side from decisive victory. A total junta collapse would be bad for Beijing, but a junta victory that provokes massive resistance attacks on Chinese nationals and Chinese projects would also be costly. Beijing is balancing, not backing. But the deeper trap isn't today's balance, it's tomorrow's certainty. Myanmar's junta has locked itself into a structural dependence from which escape becomes harder with each passing year. Every Chinese reconstruction deal, every pipeline agreement, every infrastructure contract deepens the ties. The junta's military hardware increasingly comes from Beijing. Its sources of credit flow through Chinese state banks. Its major export markets route through Chinese ports. Now ask, what other great power can offer the junta an alternative? The United States imposes sanctions and demands democracy, unacceptable terms for a military regime fighting for survival. India can't outbid Beijing and faces its own border pressures. ASEAN is fractured, with some members sympathetic but none willing to offer what Myanmar needs. Japan and South Korea are too distant and too aligned with the West to step in. This is Beijing's strategic advantage. China has accepted the geopolitical risk and the cost of Myanmar's volatility precisely because no one else is willing to. The junta, facing isolation and war, has no alternative but to accept Chinese terms. The result is a trap that tightens with every year. The regime becomes more dependent on Beijing, not less. Myanmar's economic future becomes intertwined with China's. The country's sovereignty erodes not through invasion, but through transaction. Deal by deal, port by port, pipeline by pipeline. For a watcher of geopolitics, this is the real story. Not Myanmar's internal war, but how great power competition can turn a desperate regime into a vassal, one investment at a time. The deeper risk is structural lock-in. Myanmar's junta won't escape China's orbit. Each year it becomes more embedded. I'm David. If you want to see how great powers reshape borders without firing a shot, hit subscribe.